I was counting quarters and overdue bills in my laundromat one scorching July afternoon in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, when a pale woman stumbled through the door asking for water. Without hesitating, I poured her ice-cold water, gave her my chair, and let her cool off in the back office. No questions asked. What I didn't know was she was Caroline Hayes, a billionaire tech CEO fresh off a brutal Senate hearing, and that one quiet act of kindness would go viral, spark a scandal, and change both of our lives forever. This story is fictional, created to share meaningful life lessons with you. I'm glad you're here with me. The summer that almost broke me started the same way every summer in Kensington did, with heat that didn't ask permission and debt that didn't take vacations. The sidewalk, outside Brooks Wash and Dry on Allegheny Avenue, was already hot enough to warp the soles of cheap shoes, the kind of heat that pressed down on your shoulders like a hand trying to push you underground. I had been inside since early morning, checking the coin mechanisms on machine number 4, the one that kept eating quarters without completing cycles, the one I'd been meaning to fix for months but couldn't afford the part 4. I was 47 years old, broad-shouldered but thinner than I used to be, with the kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad night but from years of them stacked on top of each other. Brooks Wash and Dry had been my mother's place first. Eleanor Brooks had run it for years out of a stubborn, beautiful refusal to let the neighborhood swallow her whole. She had painted the walls yellow herself, bought mismatched plastic chairs from 3 different church sales, and kept a cardboard box of single-serve laundry detergent packets on the counter with a handwritten sign that said, "Take what you need, leave what you can." That box was still there. I had never moved it, even now, when I couldn't afford to restock it half the time. My mother was at dialysis twice a week now, the appointments that structured my entire existence around absence and return. I had sat in the waiting room at Temple University Hospital while the machine cleaned what her kidneys could no longer clean, and I had stared at an old magazine without reading it, running numbers in my head the way you run numbers when you've run them so many times they've worn grooves into your thinking. I had driven her home afterward through the worst of the afternoon heat, the car's AC working at about 40% because the compressor needed a recharge I hadn't gotten around to. Eleanor had sat in the passenger seat with her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap, and at a red light she had said without opening her eyes, "Baby, I need you to stop worrying about me so loud. I can hear it." I hadn't answered. She had smiled the way mothers smile when they've already won the argument. My son Jamal had come home from Temple University after the spring semester. Not triumphantly, not on break, but because the financial aid had been recalculated and the gap was suddenly $1,800 that nobody in the Brooks family had. That was months ago. Jamal had arrived with a duffel bag and a silence I recognized because I had heard it in my own chest for years, the silence of a person holding something they hadn't figured out how to put down. He worked nights now at a FedEx sorting facility and slept until noon, and neither of us talked much about what was supposed to happen next. The one time we had talked about it, I was at the kitchen table with my spreadsheet, the same one I had been annotating for months, and Jamal had come down for water at midnight, stood at the refrigerator, and said without turning around, "You think I should go back in January?" It wasn't really a question. I looked at my son's back, at the set of those shoulders that were broader than my own had been at 20, at the posture of someone carrying something heavy and pretending the weight was normal. "I think you're the smartest person who's ever walked through that front door," I said, "and I think $1,800 is the stupidest reason in the world for a smart person to be sorting packages at 3 in the morning." Jamal turned then. "You got $1,800? I held my son's eyes for a long moment. "Not right now." "Okay, then." Jamal drank his water. He set the glass down carefully. "You don't have to fix everything, Dad." "Somebody does," I said. Jamal went back upstairs. I went back to my spreadsheet. The numbers didn't change. They never changed by looking at them. Brilliance without money is just a window you're not allowed to climb through. I had known that my whole life, had navigated it my whole life, had watched my own potential and other people's potential root around the same obstacle again and again, with the cheerful indifference of water finding whatever path remains open. I had built something here anyway. Eleanor had built it first, and I had held it together after she couldn't anymore, and I intended to keep holding it together, though the something I was holding was getting harder to identify by the month. I owed $4,200 in back rent to Victor Lang, who owned the building and had been patient in the way landlords get patient when they're calculating how long to wait before it becomes worth their while to evict you. The contract with the Riverside Hotel had been within reach. A small hotel 3 blocks down needed laundry service for 60 units of linens and towels. It wasn't glamorous. It was barely profitable, but it was steady. And I had been weeks away from a handshake deal when the hotel manager, a nervous man named Mr. Jenkins, mentioned wanting to see updated equipment certifications. 3 machines needed new certification tags. The cost was $340. I didn't have $340. Think about that for a moment. Not $340. $340 standing between a man and stability. Inside the laundromat that afternoon, the ceiling fans rotated with a sound like an old dog breathing, slow, labored, slightly wet. 6 of the 12 washing machines were running, the vibrations moving through the linoleum floor in overlapping rhythms. Mrs. Gloria Thompson sat in the corner nearest the door reading a magazine from months ago. Her granddaughter Sophie was drawing on a paper bag with crayons I kept in a coffee can on the counter. 2 teenagers I didn't recognize were sharing one set of earbuds and folding clothes with the mechanical indifference of people doing something they'd been forced to do. The power had already flickered twice, that lazy brownout shimmer that happened when Pico rotated load reduction through the district, and every time the lights dipped, the machines groaned, and the fans slowed, and everyone in the room looked up at the ceiling with the same silent collective plea. Not today. I was behind the counter staring at a spreadsheet I had printed from my laptop days ago, because I couldn't afford a new ink cartridge, and I'd needed to write notes in the margins. I had a pen behind my ear and a bottle of water on the counter that had been cold hours ago and was now body temperature. My phone was face down beside the water. I had been turning it face down a lot lately because Victor had started calling twice a day, and I had started needing a few extra seconds of peace before every conversation with the outside world. I looked up when the door opened, not because of any particular sound, but because of the change in air. Even the thick July heat from outside was different from the slightly less thick July heat inside, and my body registered the shift before my brain processed what I was seeing. She came through the door like someone whose legs were making decisions the rest of her hadn't signed off on. A white woman somewhere in her mid-40s in clothes that were plainly expensive in the way that very expensive things sometimes look almost plain. Dark slacks, a silk blouse the color of sea glass, low heels that were wrong for walking any real distance. Her hair was pale blonde and pulled back loose in a way that suggested it had started the day perfectly controlled. Her face was the color of cream left in sun too long, a flush across her cheeks and the bridge of her nose that wasn't sunburn exactly. It was the pink of a body running too hot on the inside. Her eyes, when they found me across the counter, had the unfocused quality of someone reading words in a language they usually know but currently can't parse. She took 3 steps inside and stopped. Her hand found one of the plastic chairs and closed around its back. She didn't sit so much as redirect gravity toward it. "I need," she started, and then her voice did something involuntary, a swallow, a catch, and she pressed her lips together and tried again. "Could I have... Is there water somewhere?" Mrs. Thompson looked up from her magazine. Sophie stopped drawing. I was already moving. I kept a cooler behind the counter, the old red and white kind with the latch that required 2 hands, and I filled it every morning with ice I bought in bags from the convenience store next door because the ice maker in the back had been broken since March. It was one of my small, non-negotiable daily expenses, the bags of ice, because in a laundromat in Philadelphia in July, cold water wasn't a luxury. It was a medical decision. I filled a paper cup to the top and walked around the counter and held it out to her without ceremony. She took it with both hands. She drank. She closed her eyes for a moment, and I watched the slight tremor in her wrists and recognized it the same way you recognize any kind of exhaustion that has reached the body before the mind has admitted it. "When did you last eat something?" I asked, not unkindly, with the flat directness of someone who doesn't have time to approach bad news from a distance. She blinked. "This morning, I think. Early." A pause. "What time is it?" Something crossed her face. I didn't know what it meant, but it meant something. "I've been driving since 9, she said mostly to herself. "I stopped for gas, but I didn't—" She stopped. She looked at the cup of water. "Thank you. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. It's water." I refilled the cup without being asked. "You look like you got sunstroke coming. The back office has AC. It's not much, but it's something. You can sit back there while you level out." She looked at me then, and for a second the unfocused quality in her eyes sharpened into something more alert, more surprised, as though she'd expected a different sentence to follow the word something. I just held the refilled cup toward her and waited. "I don't want to," she started. "You're not," I said. "Come on." Her name was Caroline Hayes, though you would only know that name if you read TechCrunch with any regularity or had watched the Senate Commerce Committee hearing that had aired on C-SPAN and then been clipped and shared approximately 400,000 times across social media in the preceding days. Hayes Technologies, $17 billion in valuation, 340,000 employees across 11 countries, a platform that processed more daily transactions than the GDP of some mid-sized nations. Caroline Hayes had built it from a 2-person operation in a Palo Alto garage over 14 years, which was the part that business magazines like to lead with: the garage detail, the bootstrap mythology, the American dream in miniature. They mentioned less frequently that the Palo Alto garage belonged to her family, that her father had been an early semiconductor investor, that her first round of funding came from a network of people who already knew her name. Not because those facts made her success fraudulent, but because no story fits cleanly into the shape we wanted it to. She was 44 years old. She had not taken a vacation in 3 years that was not also a speaking engagement. She had not been in a relationship that lasted more than 8 months since 2019. She had $400 million in the bank, and she was, in the way that certain kinds of sustained success produce, genuinely and profoundly lonely in a way she hadn't yet found the right vocabulary for. The Senate hearing had been brutal in the specific way that Washington is brutal, not with cruelty exactly, but with the grinding procedural fluorescent-lit quality of being taken apart by people who understand exactly how cameras work. The antitrust inquiry into Hayes Technologies' acquisition of 3 smaller competitors had been building for 18 months. Her legal team was excellent. Her talking points had been calibrated by 3 separate PR firms. She had sat at the table in her best neutral authority blazer and answered questions for hours and said nothing technically wrong, and had come out of it feeling hollowed out in a way she didn't have a word for. Afterward, her head of security had steered her toward the motorcade, and something in Caroline Hayes had simply quietly refused. She had gotten into the rental car she had insisted on having available for exactly this kind of moment, and had driven north on 95 and then west on something smaller and then smaller still, following the exit ramps that her brain chose the way a pinball chooses direction. Not randomly, but according to invisible angles she wasn't consciously controlling. She had been trying to find the version of herself that existed before conference rooms and depositions and shareholder calls. What she found instead was that when you don't eat anything after early morning and you drive for hours in a car with a malfunctioning climate control system and you're running on cortisol and the residual adrenaline of hours of testimony, your body will eventually make its own decision about how the afternoon is going to go. The phone had died somewhere on the way. The wallet was in the bag she had left on the seat of the motorcade SUV. Just a woman who was too hot and too depleted and too far from anything familiar. Now she sat in the back office of Brooks Wash and Dry in Kensington, eating peanut butter crackers from a sleeve I had produced from the bottom desk drawer, and she felt, strange as this is to say, safer than she had in days. The room was small enough to know exactly what it was. The filing cabinet had a dent in the side. The air conditioner rattled when it cycled up. The photograph on the wall showed a woman with my same broad cheekbones and that quality in the eyes. Not hardness exactly, but a kind of resolved attention. The eyes of someone who had decided a long time ago what they were and what they weren't, and had stopped negotiating with that decision. Through the thin wall she could hear me, the man who hadn't asked her name. She could hear me talking to a customer, my voice low and patient, then the sound of a coin mechanism being tested, then a child laughing at something, then silence, and then the overlapping hum of machines running their cycles. She heard me conducting the ordinary difficult business of keeping a small operation alive through a hot afternoon. And there was something in the rhythm of it, the lack of performance, the simple persistence of it, that she found herself listening to the way you listen to rain when you've been indoors too long. She had been in rooms with presidents and prime ministers and people whose decisions moved billions of dollars and millions of lives. She had been photographed and profiled and dissected and celebrated and investigated. And she could not remember the last time a person had done something for her without first knowing who she was. I hadn't Googled her. She could tell. She was used to the microsecond of recognition that people tried to hide and usually couldn't, the slight recalibration of posture, the quality change in the voice. I had looked at her the way you look at a person who needs water and doesn't have any. I had responded to the fact of her, not the information about her. Her mind, which never stopped running calculations, was already doing it now. The laundromat was struggling. She could read the room the way people who've built things from nothing learned to read rooms. The printed spreadsheet visible through the open door, the marginal notes in ballpoint, the deferred maintenance visible in every machine, the cost per cup calculation she was doing involuntarily on the bag of ice I had bought that morning. She understood in the way you understand the architecture of a building from looking at the exterior that the man on the other side of that wall was close to a particular kind of edge, and I had given her ice water anyway. I had given up my chair. When I looked in to check on her, she asked me, "Do you always do this? Help people who come in who aren't customers?" I leaned against the doorframe with the unhurried quality of a man who answers questions at the speed they deserve. "Mrs. Thompson next door. Her husband died 2 winters ago. Hot days, she comes and sits here because she doesn't have central air, and I'm not going to charge her for sitting. The kids down the block, their mom's working a double. They come in and do homework on the folding table till she gets home. It's not a policy." I paused. "It's just what the place is." Caroline Hayes, who had spent months defending herself against the accusation that her company had used its power to consolidate markets and reduce meaningful human choice, sat in this small, rattling room and heard a man describe without any intention of making a point an entirely different theory of what a business could be for. She didn't say that. She just said, "Thank you." I nodded and went back out front. She sat for a while longer and watched the photograph of the woman on the wall and thought about the last time she had operated according to a standard rather than a strategy. She couldn't remember. That was the answer she kept arriving at. She honestly could not remember. The afternoon had its own arithmetic, and I was running the numbers whether I wanted to or not. The power flickered again, and this time it didn't come back up all the way. The machines dropped to half speed. The fan slowed to something ornamental, moving air with the commitment of a sigh. I walked the row of machines, checking the cycles, calculating which loads were close enough to completion to let run on reduced power and which would need to wait. It was the kind of practical triage you get good at when resources have always been finite, when make it work is less a philosophy than a survival skill inherited from necessity. That's when Bob Harrington appeared. Bob Harrington was not a bad man. He was the kind of man that cities produce in abundance, overextended, slightly righteous about it, and possessed of the particular entitlement of someone who has paid for a service and therefore believes the universe owes him a certain standard of outcome. He carried a laundry bag that probably weighed 40 pounds, and he had the energy of a person who had been looking forward to complaining about something all day. "These machines are running slow," he said, not as an observation but as a verdict. "Power reduction," I said without turning from machine 7. "Rolling brownout. Pico does it district by district. On days above 95, the machines are still running." "I paid full price," Bob said. "Full cycle, full speed. This isn't what I paid for." I turned. I looked at Bob with the patience that comes not from having a lot of it, but from having learned that spending it recklessly makes everything worse. When the cycle completes, if the wash is inadequate, I'll refund the cycle. That's my policy. But the brownout isn't my decision. Bob's eyes traveled to the back hallway where the office door was partially open, where the faint sound of the struggling air conditioner was audible. His phone was out. I noticed it the way you notice things that change the texture of a room. Not dramatically, just a shift. "You running the AC back there while the machines are slow?" Bob asked. "I have someone resting back there who came in with heat exhaustion symptoms," I said. "The AC back there runs on a separate circuit." "Seems like a choice," Bob said, phone still in hand, still at the wrong angle. "Running a C for someone who isn't even a customer while paying customers get slow machines." I held the man's gaze for a long 3 seconds. The machine behind me beeped its end-of-cycle signal. Sophie knocked over a crayon. The afternoon continued its slow grinding forward. "It is a choice," I said. "I stand behind it." Bob left without saying anything else, which was its own kind of victory, though not the kind that solved anything. And I, watching the man walk out with his phone in hand and the particular posture of someone who has already decided what to post, had a feeling that settled somewhere between my shoulders like a cramp that wouldn't release. I was right to have that feeling. I just didn't know yet how right. Victor Lang called. I answered because the thing about Victor was that not answering didn't stop the debt from existing. It just delayed the conversation and added an edge of mutual resentment to it that made everything harder. "Michael, we need to talk about next month. I know I've got an offer for the building, a development company. They're serious and they're moving fast. I told them I had a current tenant with a long history, and I wanted to give you first right to make this right before I made any decisions." "How much are we short?" "You're $4,200 in arrears, plus next month is in days. That's another $1,800. $6,000, I said. $6,000, Victor confirmed. And the gentleness in his voice was worse than harshness would have been, because gentleness from a person delivering bad news means they don't think you can fix it either. I hung up and stood very still behind the counter and looked at my mother's cardboard box of detergent packets. I had restocked it that morning with packets because they were on sale, and even in the middle of everything, the box had to be stocked. Then Mr. Jenkins from the Riverside Hotel called. "Michael, my regional manager is pushing me to make a decision this week. I need to know by the end of the week if you can get me those tags." "I'm working on it," I said. Which was what you say when you mean I'm trying to figure out how to work on it. "End of the week," Mr. Jenkins said, and hung up. $340, $6,000, $1,800. The numbers stacked like stones on a chest. I pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed one breath at a time. The present tense is all you can manage anyway, and I had learned that younger than I should have had to. She emerged later, smoothed her slacks, and walked to the counter with the air of someone who had made a decision. The color was back in her face, and her posture had returned to something that belonged to a person who was used to being in charge of things. "I need to ask a favor," she said. "My car is parked a few blocks from here. The phone's dead. Is there somewhere close I can charge it?" I reached under the counter and produced a charging cable connected to a power strip. "What type?" She blinked. I plugged in her phone. The screen lit. She watched it for a second and then looked up. "You didn't ask who I was." "Didn't need to," I said. I went back to my spreadsheet. "You needed water. You needed to sit down. That's enough to know." She stood at the counter while her phone charged and she said nothing, and I did not feel the silence, and the fans turned their slow circles and the machines ran their cycles and Philadelphia went on being itself in the heat. She left a while later. Phone charged, color restored, with a quiet thank you that she said once and meant completely. She did not look back when she walked out the door. I watched her go and then turned back to the numbers that still didn't add up and the deadline and the $6,000 I didn't have. I did not know her name. I had not wanted to. Weeks later, 3 things happened in the same short stretch. I did not know when the first one landed that all 3 were connected. I did not know that the woman with the silk blouse was the thread running through all of them. and I did not know that the worst of the three would arrive before the best of them. It appeared on a Thursday morning, shared into a local Philadelphia Facebook group by someone I didn't know, and then reposted by someone I did, a neighbor a couple blocks down who probably thought she was being helpful. The caption read, "Is this a PR stunt? CEO spotted hiding in Allegheny Avenue laundromat after hearing. Anyone know what's going on here?" The video was seconds long, shot on a phone, slightly shaky, the angle of someone trying to look like they're not recording. It showed the inside of Brooks Wash and Dry, the yellow walls, the row of machines, the sound of the brownout slowed fans, and through the partial opening of the back office door, the edge of a woman in a pale blouse sitting in the rolling chair. The comment thread beneath it had dozens of replies by morning, and the replies were doing what comment threads do, filling in the story with whatever facts they didn't have. "That's definitely Caroline Hayes. Senate hearing was weeks ago. Now she's in a laundromat in Philadelphia. PR 100%, or she's hiding. Heard she took off after the testimony and nobody knew where she was. Why is the AC running in the back for one person? What's that about? The guy who runs this place is shady. Look at the brownout complaint thread from last week." I read it in the morning, phone in hand, coffee going cold on the counter beside me. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down carefully the way you put down something fragile that has already cracked, and I stood in the empty laundromat before opening and looked at the yellow walls my mother had painted. I had done nothing wrong. That was the thing I kept returning to. A woman had walked in. She had needed water and a chair. I had given her water and a chair. That was the entire story. But I understood with the instinct of a black man who had operated a business in this city for years that "I did nothing wrong" was not a sufficient defense against the particular damage that a short video and a comment thread could do to a small operation that was already running on the margin of its own survival. Victor would see it. Mr. Jenkins might see it. And whoever was interested in the building, the development company Victor had mentioned, would absolutely see it because development companies have people who watch these things. The second call came from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice. Professional, crisp. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Sandra Kim. I'm Director of Communications for Hayes Technologies. We became aware of a video circulating about an incident at your establishment weeks ago. Miss Hayes would like to personally address—" "Miss Hayes is welcome to call herself," I said. A pause. "Of course, I'll arrange that." I hung up and looked at the phone and then at the door which Mrs. Thompson was about to come through because she came at the same time every week. And whatever was happening in the wider world of tech executives and social media speculation, Gloria Thompson needed somewhere cool to sit for the morning, and that was not going to change. The third call came later that morning, the one that made the whole thing land differently. It was Caroline herself. No assistant's voice first, no buffer, just, "Mr. Brooks, it's Caroline Hayes. I owe you an explanation and probably an apology for what—" "You didn't shoot the video." "No," she said, "but it's my face in it. And I know what that kind of attention can do to a small business, especially—" She stopped, started again more carefully, "especially a business that was already dealing with challenges it didn't need compounded." The specificity of that last phrase, the acknowledgement that she had seen the spreadsheet, that she understood the shape of what I was carrying, settled something in me that had been braced since morning. "I'm not in trouble because of you," I said. "Not entirely," she said. "But I'd like to help make sure you're not in more trouble than you were before I walked through your door." I looked at the box of detergent packets on the counter. Eleanor's handwriting on the sign, "Take what you need, leave what you can." I had run this place on that logic for years, and the logic had cost me things, and it had also been the only thing that kept the place from becoming something I didn't recognize. I was not going to start making different calculations now because dozens of people had opinions in a comment thread. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I didn't help you because of what you could do for me afterward." "I know," she said, and then, after a pause that was shorter than it felt, "That's why I'm calling." The video didn't go viral in the way the phrase usually means. It circulated through local Philadelphia networks for a few days, picked up briefly by a city blog, then subsided. One reporter sent me an email. I didn't respond. The comment thread eventually moved on to other things because comment threads always do. The damage it caused was real, but limited. Victor called, sounding concerned in the way that contained the word liability without using it. Mr. Jenkins sent a text saying he'd seen something online and wanted to talk. I answered both of them calmly and honestly, and the conversations ended without incident. What the video did not damage was the one thing that mattered, what had actually happened inside those walls. A woman had needed water. A man had given it. The rest was noise. And I had enough experience with noise to know you don't start building your life around it. Weeks later, the lawyers arrived, and then Caroline herself. And what came with her was not a gesture. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday, paper-clipped to my door in the early morning, and I held it in both hands and read it with the specific hollow clarity you feel when a bad thing you've been anticipating finally makes itself official. 30 days. Victor had not made this decision lightly. I could see that in the language, could see the weight of a man choosing between two impossible loyalties. There were no villains in the notice. That almost made it worse. I called Jamal. The phone rang several times and went to voicemail because Jamal was sleeping, which he needed to do because he worked nights, which he did because college was interrupted, which happened because money ran out, which it did because Eleanor's dialysis cost what it cost. The whole chain of causes sat behind the notice like a sentence in a language I had been learning to read for years and still couldn't fully translate. I called my mother. She told me to pray. I told her I would. I sat down on a plastic chair and stared at the detergent box and thought about years of yellow walls and the quiet, unremarkable daily work of keeping something alive that the world kept trying to let die. Days later, 2 lawyers arrived, younger in suits that cost more than I made in a month, carrying briefcases with the silent efficiency of people who are used to being the most prepared individuals in any room they enter. They asked if they could sit. I told them there was a folding table in the back. They slid a document toward me. "Our client would like to propose a conversation," the taller one said. "Who's your client?" I asked. "Miss Caroline Hayes." I looked at the document, then at the lawyers, then at the document again. "She's welcome to come herself." She came on a Tuesday. Dark jeans, white button-down shirt, flat shoes right for walking. No lawyers, no assistant. She walked into Brooks Wash and Dry in the afternoon, and the fans were turning, and Mrs. Thompson was in her chair and 2 machines were running their cycles and the detergent box was restocked because I had made it to the dollar store on the weekend. She stood at the counter. I waited. "I should have introduced myself before," she said. "You needed water," I said. "Not introductions." She almost smiled. "I'm Caroline Hayes, Michael Brooks." A brief, real silence in which both of us existed simply as what we were. A man who ran a laundromat and a woman who ran a company, and the enormous ordinary distance between those 2 facts. "I heard about the notice," she said, "from your lawyers. My lawyers heard about it because I asked them to look into this address," she said. And she said it plainly, without softening the mechanism. "I wanted to understand the situation." "Why?" She looked at the photograph of Eleanor on the wall visible through the open office door, then back at me. "Because weeks ago I walked into a place I'd never heard of, and a person I didn't know gave me water and a chair and crackers and didn't ask anything in return. And I have been thinking about that every single day since, about what kind of place operates on that logic, about whether I've ever operated on that logic. I want to make a proposal," she continued. "Not charity, not a gesture, a business arrangement that I think works for both parties, and if you disagree, I'll walk out and call my lawyers off, and that will be the end of it." I leaned against the counter. "Talk." She laid it out methodically. A cooling hub, one of 12 she was proposing to fund through the Hayes Technologies Community Infrastructure Initiative in cities with extreme heat vulnerability. Staffed, air-conditioned, Open to anyone regardless of whether they were there to do laundry or just get out of the heat. The research was already done. Extreme heat killed more Americans annually than any other weather event, and it killed people disproportionately in neighborhoods like this one, where air conditioning was unaffordable and community spaces were rare. The funding would cover the back rent, the equipment certifications, the building repairs, and 3 years of operating costs. Her corporate division needed a laundry service, linens, uniforms, event textiles from 3 Mid-Atlantic offices, steady contracted work, plus neighborhood-scale renovation with tenant protection and rent stabilization built into the legal structure. I listened to all of it, then I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "This is a PR move. You're under antitrust review and you want a community investment story." Caroline didn't flinch. "That's a fair reading. That's not a denial." "No," she said, "it's not. I won't pretend that there's no benefit to Hayes Technologies in being associated with community infrastructure. There is. I also won't pretend that benefit makes the water station less cold or the cooling less real for the people who walk in off the street in July." She held my eyes. "Both things can be true." I nodded slowly. "What happens in 3 years when the funding cycle ends? What happens if your board decides this isn't worth the line item?" She reached into her bag and slid a second document across the counter. "Community trust structure. The cooling hub funding goes into an escrow managed by a 3-person board. 1 person I appoint, 1 you appoint, 1 appointed by a neighborhood council. I cannot unilaterally withdraw it. The laundry contract is a 5-year binding agreement, not a letter of intent." And the tenant protection terms, she slid a 3rd page across, "are recorded with the city. They're not in my control to undo, even if I wanted to." I looked at the documents without touching them. "You thought about those questions before I asked them?" "Yes," she said, "because you knew I'd ask them, because anyone running a place like this on the logic you're running it on has been let down before by things that sounded good until they didn't. I didn't want to give you something that depended on my continued goodwill. I wanted to give you something that held even if I changed my mind." She paused, "which is the only kind of commitment that actually means anything." I picked up the first document and read it. I read slowly, and I read the footnotes, which is where the truth always lives in legal language. And what I found in the footnotes matched what she described at the table. After several minutes, I set it down. 1 condition. The same thing you said in your proposal. Nobody gets turned away when they need water, shade, or somewhere to sit. Not ever. Not for any business reason. That has to be in writing. Not as a preference, as a breach condition." Caroline looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then she opened her folder and produced a pen. "Tell me exactly how you want it worded," she said, "and I'll have my lawyers draft it tonight." I told her. She wrote it down in the margin of the document in her own handwriting. Then she looked up. "I want to understand something," she said. "You've been running this place on that principle for years, at significant personal cost. Why?" I was quiet for long enough that it wasn't awkward, just honest. "My mother built this place out of the idea that a business is a promise you make to the neighborhood it's in. I've been keeping her promise." I looked at the photograph on the wall. "Also because I've watched what happens to neighborhoods where nobody keeps their promises, and I didn't want to be one more person who let this one down." Caroline looked at the photograph too, at Eleanor Brooks laughing on opening day years ago, triumphant and certain. "Okay," she said finally. "Then we have a conversation to finish." "Yeah," I said. I turned toward the cooler. "You want some water?" She laughed, a surprised real sound. "Yes," she said. "Please." I filled 2 cups, and we sat at the folding table in the back and talked for hours while the afternoon ran its course. And when we were done, the machines were quiet, and the street outside had gone from the white gold of peak afternoon to the lower orange of approaching evening, and 2 people who had started the day in entirely different worlds had worked out what it might mean to build something together on the logic of a cup of cold water, given without calculation to a stranger who needed it. The contractor argument came next. The project manager Caroline sent was named Ryan Mitchell, and he arrived in August with a timeline on a tablet and the confident efficiency of someone who had overseen many corporate build-outs in the previous years and considered himself very good at his job, which he was. He shook my hand with the grip of a man who communicates credentials through physical contact and immediately spread his plans across the folding table in the back. 8 weeks, phased in 3 stages, Ryan said. We bring in the crew next week. They're out of D.C., done 3 commercial retrofits this summer, fast and clean. The cooling system installation is week 1, electrical upgrade week 2, machines and fixtures weeks 3 through 5, finish work and inspection 6 through 8. We can have you operational by October 1st. I looked at the timeline. I looked at the crew breakdown. 6 names, D.C. addresses. I looked at Ryan. No, I said. Ryan blinked. No to the timeline. No to the crew. I want contractors from the neighborhood, or at minimum from Kensington. Ryan set down his stylus with the careful deliberateness of a man recalibrating. Mr. Brooks, I understand the impulse, but we're on a compressed schedule, and the cooling system is specialized. Local contractors at this scale... Wayne Dawson has done HVAC in this zip code for 18 years, I said. His crew installed the system in the community center on Frankfurt. The electrical work, I want Terrence Gilmore. He's 2 blocks down. His license is current. I've seen his work. The finish and fixtures, the Ortiz brothers have a shop on North Avenue. I know their work. I know their people. I looked at Ryan directly. I'm not asking you to go find people. I'm telling you who these are. Ryan started, then stopped himself. Restarted. The timeline will stretch. Wayne Dawson's crew is booked. I'd have to check. Coordinating multiple local contractors versus one unified team is going to cost more time. Yes, I said, and more money probably. I know that. Miss Hayes approved a budget based on... Then we should talk to Miss Hayes, Ryan said, and his voice was the same even temperature it always was, which was somehow harder to argue with than anger would have been. Caroline came in person. She sat at the same folding table. Ryan to her right, me across from them. The plan spread between us. Ryan made his case efficiently. 8 weeks versus potentially 12. Cost overrun estimate of 15 to 20%. Coordination risk. Warranty coverage gaps if the cooling system was installed by a crew unfamiliar with the specific equipment. Caroline listened to all of it. Then she looked at me. Tell me why this matters enough to pay more for it and take longer. Because in 2 years, when something needs maintenance, I need someone who's from here to fix it, not someone who drives in from D.C. Because when Wayne Dawson's crew does this job, Dawson's neighborhood sees it happen, and that means something about what this place is. Because the point of this building is that it belongs to this community, and that starts with who builds it. I paused. And because the people I named are good at their jobs. This isn't charity work. This is the right hire. Ryan exhaled through his nose, which was the sound of a man doing math he doesn't like the answer to. Caroline looked at the plans. Then she looked at Ryan. Get Wayne Dawson on the phone. Ask him when he can start. Ryan started to say something. She looked at him and he closed his laptop instead. The renovation took weeks, not the original 8. It cost % over the original estimate. Dawson's crew worked 6 days a week in the August heat. And on the 3rd Saturday, his cousin joined because the cousin had done tile work and the bathroom needed retiling. And Wayne knew the right person because that is how neighborhoods work when they're working. Terrence Gilmore caught a wiring issue in the north wall that would have caused problems with the cooling system. Caught it because he knew the building's age and knew what buildings of that age in that part of Philadelphia tended to do with their wiring. The Ortiz brothers built the homework table in the children's corner from reclaimed wood, and it was the most solid piece of furniture in the entire building. Ryan came in at week 7, looked around at the progress, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said to me, not as a concession, but as a genuine observation, "The Dawson crew works differently than what I've seen on corporate projects. Everyone knows everyone. Nobody's watching the clock in the same way. They're building something that'll still be here in 20 years, I said. In their own neighborhood, that changes how you work." Ryan nodded once. He didn't say anything else. But I noticed that in the last weeks of the project, Ryan stopped talking about scaling the model and started asking questions about how I had found the contractors, what the relationships looked like, whether the same approach might apply to other hub locations in the pipeline. I answered the questions, all of them, because information shared freely, I had learned from Eleanor, had a way of coming back as something more useful than information kept. The first real test came before the hub was officially open. Days from the ribbon, the signage not fully installed, the children's corner still being stocked when the heat index hit high on a Wednesday in late September. Jamal was on site managing final punch list items when the first people started arriving. Not the contractors, neighbors, a woman with 2 toddlers who'd heard from someone that the place had AC. An older man I recognized from around the block moving slowly, sweat on his collar. Then more, because word travels fast in neighborhoods where resources are scarce, and within minutes there were dozens of people in a space that was not yet officially ready to have that many people in it. Jamal called me. I came. I stood in the doorway and looked at the toddlers on the not quite finished floor, and the older man with the wet collar who had closed his eyes and was simply breathing the cool air. And I made the decision that took approximately 1 second. Open the cooler. Cups are in the 3rd cabinet. Do not turn anyone away. The official capacity for the cooling function was 40. They hit close to that by afternoon. The machines weren't running, not officially operational, but the AC was and the water was cold, and that was what people needed. At one point, a man came in who was visibly intoxicated, loud, knocking against the new folding chairs, and the room went tense with the specific familiar tension of a space trying to hold multiple kinds of needs simultaneously. Jamal moved without hesitation. Not aggressively, he stepped toward the man, lowered his voice, and spoke the way I had spoken to Bob Harrington, even, direct, without heat. "Hey, you're welcome here. I need you to sit down and drink some water and be cool. Can you do that?" The man looked at him. "I ain't bothering nobody." "I know," Jamal said. "Sit down here." He pulled a chair away from the crowd toward the edge of the room, giving the man space without giving him an exit. He set a cup of water next to him. "Stay as long as you need." The man sat. He drank the water. He fell asleep in the chair, which was not ideal, and was also, in the plainest terms, a person who had needed somewhere safe to sleep. I watched this from the counter. I watched my son manage the room with the competence of someone who had been preparing for this without knowing it. The FedEx nights and the Temple University logistics courses and the years of watching a father hold a difficult room with calm, and I felt something shift in my chest that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something larger and less comfortable. The feeling of recognizing that your child has become someone who can carry things you couldn't carry at their age. Later, when the heat index had dropped, Jamal and I sat in the back and we wrote down what had happened and what we'd need going forward. A check-in protocol, not to police who came in, but to make sure no one arrived in a medical emergency without someone noticing. A specific procedure for situations like the man in the chair, which was not an incident, but which deserved a thoughtful response rather than an improvised one. A supply list for the day the hub was overwhelmed rather than just full. The standards, not just nobody gets turned away, Jamal said, writing in the margins of the punch list. The standards, nobody who comes in gets less safe because of how many other people are here. I looked at my son. "Write that down, somewhere it'll stay," I said. Jamal wrote it on the back of a piece of scrap lumber from the renovation in permanent marker, and we nailed it to the inside of the supply closet door where the staff would see it every time they opened it. It was not decorative. It was operational. It was the difference between a principle and a standard. The principle was what you believed. The standard was what you measured against when everything got hard and loud and crowded and you had to make a decision in seconds. The hub opened officially days later. Dawson's crew was there. So were the Ortiz brothers. Terrence Gilmore came with his wife. Mrs. Thompson sat in the chair that had always been hers and nodded at the room with the approval of someone who has been watching a thing build toward what it was always supposed to be. Eleanor Brooks, driven over after dialysis by Jamal, sat next to her, The two women had not met before. By the end of the afternoon, they had established an understanding about which chair belonged to whom and what time of day was best for conversation and what time was best for quiet, which is its own kind of friendship. I stood at the counter and looked at the room and thought about that afternoon in July when a woman had come through the door and I had given her water, and I hadn't known what would come from it, and it wouldn't have mattered if I had, because you don't make those decisions based on outcomes. You make them based on what the moment asks of you and what you have to give. The standard holds. That was the thought. And that afternoon, in the not-quite-finished space with the cooler running and the chairs full and Jamal's handwriting on the closet door, it had been tested, and it had held, and holding had not been easy and had not been free. And that was exactly what made it mean something. The anniversary of the cooling hub's opening fell on a Tuesday in July, the anniversary of the hottest July on record in Philadelphia, which was also the hottest July on record up to that point and would likely not hold that distinction for long. By morning, the temperature was high and climbing, and by late morning, the cooling hub at Allegheny Avenue had dozens of people in it, which was more than its original capacity and exactly what it had been redesigned to hold. The sign above the door said "The Cooling Hub" in letters simple and readable from the street. Below the name, smaller, "From a cup of water and a plastic chair, 2024. I had told Caroline I wanted people to know it came from the smallest possible thing so they'd understand that what they were standing in wasn't the result of a grand plan or a visionary moment. It was the result of doing the obvious thing when the obvious thing cost something and you did it anyway. Inside, the machines ran in their steady rhythm. The children's corner had books that were current and crayons that were stocked and a homework table occupied every weekday afternoon. The charging wall had ports and a small sign, "Phones, welcome. People first." Mrs. Thompson was in her chair. Sophie, who was older now and serious about everything, was reading a chapter book from the lending library and refusing to be distracted by the celebration happening around her. Victor Lang stood near the window with a glass of iced tea, looking at the building he had owned for years in a way that contained some of what he had expected it to become and none of what it actually had. He had signed the renovation agreement months ago and the tenant protection terms and watched the block begin the slow, visible process of repair without displacement that urban economists said wasn't possible, and that this block was quietly demonstrating was in fact possible when investment came with different terms attached. Caroline came in the side door the way she usually came, without announcement. She had become, in the odd and genuine way that consistent presence produces, a known figure in the neighborhood. Not celebrated, not photographed, just known. The woman who came in on Thursdays, the one who brought peanut butter crackers that first time back because she was returning something and didn't know any other way to say it. That was when Raymond Price spoke up. He owned the dry cleaner 2 doors down, had been on Allegheny Avenue for years, and had the expression of a man who had decided on the way over that he was going to say the thing he had been saying to other people quietly for weeks. He stepped to the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and said it at a volume the whole space could hear. "I want to say something, and I need people not to take it wrong." He looked at me. He looked at Caroline. "This hub, I know what it's done for the neighborhood. I'm not against it, but I've got to be honest. I've already seen the Zillow numbers on this block. I've already had 2 calls from developers asking if I'm looking to sell. You bring investment, you bring attention, and you bring the people who follow attention. And those people—" He looked around the room at the mix of faces who had come for the anniversary, at the people in the chairs. "Those people are not all going to be the people who've been here." The room didn't go silent exactly. It went careful. There's a difference. Victor Lang looked at his shoes. He knew those Zillow numbers. He checked them himself with the complicated feeling of a man who has spent months trying to do the right thing and has discovered that doing the right thing does not automatically prevent the wrong thing from happening in its vicinity. 3 other people nodded along with Raymond Price. One of them was a woman I recognized. She had been in the neighborhood longer than the Laundromat, longer than Eleanor, and she had earned the right to that nod. I let the room hold the question for a moment. Then I stepped out from behind the counter. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke the way I always spoke, at the speed things deserved. Raymond, I hear you, I said, and you're right that I can't promise you the block stays the same. I can't promise that attention doesn't bring the people who follow attention. I paused. What I can promise is this place, this building, what happens in here, that the cooling stays free, that the homework table stays free, that nobody gets a code to use the charging wall, that the contract with Caroline's company says what it says and it's filed with the city. And I didn't sign it because I trusted somebody's goodwill. I signed it because the terms are binding. I looked at Raymond, then the rest of the block. That fight is real, and it's not over, and it needs people like you to keep fighting it. But don't ask me to close this door because other doors might open somewhere else. That's not math I know how to do. Raymond was quiet. The woman who had nodded was quiet. Sophie had put down her book. Caroline stepped forward, not to take the microphone, there was no microphone, just to be visible in the room as herself, not as a resource or an answer. I want to say something too, she said, and I want to be honest about it. Raymond is pointing at a real thing. Investment follows investment. I know that because I've built businesses on that principle. I know how the math works. She looked at Victor. The tenant protections in this building are recorded. They're real. But I can't record protections in every building on this block. And I won't pretend that what we've done here is a sufficient response to what Raymond is describing. A pause. What I can do is put money into a neighborhood stability fund, not controlled by me, not controlled by any company, managed by a board of residents from this zip code, not to stop change, to make sure the people here have resources to shape what kind of change happens. She looked at Raymond. That's not a solution. It's a down payment on a process. You'd have to be part of the process for it to mean anything. I'm asking if you're willing to. Raymond looked at her for a long moment with the specific scrutiny of a man who has heard many things promised and has a well-calibrated sense of which promises were kept. What's the governance structure? He asked. It was exactly the right question. Caroline pulled out her phone and started showing him the document her lawyers had drafted, and two other neighbors leaned in to look, and Victor Lang put down his iced tea and came over. And within minutes, what had been a moment of confrontation had become something more complicated and more real, and more like the actual work of building a community rather than the performance of it. Jamal gave his speech in the middle of all that, standing in the room while Raymond Price and Victor Lang were still reading Caroline's governance document. He said what was true. My dad taught me that a business is a promise you make to the neighborhood it's in. He's been keeping that promise for a long time with a lot less than he deserved to work with. Now we have enough to keep it properly. That's not the end of anything. It's just finally having the right tools for the job we were already doing. He sat down. The room made the sound that means something landed correctly. Later that evening, when most people had gone and the room was quiet again, I stood in the space that had been my mother's space and my space, and was now the neighborhood space, and Caroline found me there. She had stayed to help fold some of the event linens because she had been doing that on Thursday afternoons for months. Raymond's right, you know, I said. Yes, she said. She folded a towel. I know the stability fund doesn't solve it. No, she said, it doesn't. She set the towel down and looked at me. I spent a long time building things that scaled, that meant something to a lot of people, but didn't mean anything specific to any particular person in any particular place. I'm trying to learn a different way. She paused. I'm not sure I'm any good at it yet. You asked Raymond for his opinion on the governance structure, I said. And then you listened to his answer and changed a term in the document. She looked at me. Yes. That's the beginning of good at it, I said. The machines ran. The fans turned. Eleanor's box sat on the counter, stocked. The sign held its 2 sentences in clear, legible letters that anyone walking past on Allegheny Avenue could read from outside through the clean glass of the door. Kindness is not a business model, it's a standard. Below it, in the community notice board we had installed, there was a flyer for the Neighborhood Stability Board. Its first meeting the following Thursday. Raymond Price listed as one of the founding members. Victor Lang was another. So was the woman who nodded during Raymond's speech. and a young Temple University student named Jamal Brooks, who was back in school in the fall. $1,800 is a lot until a business has a contract and a standard and a reason to hold together, and then it turns out to be findable. It was the first thing I paid when the Hayes contract came through. Jamal hadn't asked. I hadn't announced it. I just transferred the money and texted my son, January. That was all the message needed to be. I did not become a millionaire. I became something that in certain neighborhoods, in certain conversations among people who understand what it costs to hold a thing together through sustained effort and limited resources, carries more weight than that. I became the person you point to when you need to explain what you mean by integrity. When you need to demonstrate that the principle was real and not just rhetorical. When you need proof that someone actually lived it, not just said it. On an ordinary afternoon in the heat, the standard held. That was the thing. After everything that had tried to erode it, the debt and the brownouts and the difficult customers and the landlord's phone calls and the video and the comment thread and the antitrust hearings on the other side of the ledger and the way the world kept presenting excellent reasons to be less than what you'd said you were, the standard held. One cup at a time, one afternoon at a time. One person walking in from the heat and finding that the door was open and that the opening was not conditional, and that the coolness on the other side of it was not a gift, but a right. That was the story. That was all of it. Everything else is detail. Join me to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Looking back on that sweltering afternoon in Kensington when Caroline Hayes stumbled into my laundromat desperate for water, my heart still aches with the raw truth of what happened next. I was barely holding on, back rent piling up, my mom's dialysis draining every spare dollar, and my son Jamal putting his dreams on hold at Temple University. Yet something deeper inside me refused to turn away from a stranger in need. I didn't hand her that cup of ice-cold water or offer my chair because I saw a billionaire or smelled opportunity. I did it because she was simply a person whose body was shutting down right in front of me. And my mother Eleanor had raised me to run this place on one unbreakable standard. A business is a promise to your neighborhood, not a transaction. Kindness isn't some clever strategy you pull out when it suits you. It's the quiet choice you make every single day, especially when it costs you something real. Late nights staring at spreadsheets, tough calls from the landlord, and the constant fear that one more bad break would end it all. That single act of plain human care ended up saving my shop, reopened the door for Jamal's future, and turned our struggling corner into a true cooling hub, where neighbors found not just relief from the heat, but a sense of dignity and belonging they'd been missing. It showed me, and I hope it shows you, that when you hold tight to that standard through debt, doubt, and pressure, life has this beautiful way of answering back with connections and second chances you could never engineer on your own. Real integrity isn't loud or flashy. It's the steady promise you keep when no one's watching, and it ripples out farther than you'll ever know. If this story stirred something deep in your soul like it still does in mine, drop a comment below and tell me. What's one small kindness someone showed you that changed everything, or what personal standard have you fought to keep alive in your own hard seasons? I read every single one and can't wait to feel that connection with you. And if these heartfelt lessons about living with an open heart hit home, hit that like button, subscribe right now, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that reminds us what truly matters. Your support keeps this community alive and these real emotional tales coming. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here with me.